Dr. Turner August. My name is Zachary Sedigiani, and I'm just going to be talking about Pavlov, Watson's, and Bardua's experiment and giving my thoughts about them. But first, I'm going to start with Pavlov's experiment. So, Pavlov was originally studying dog salivation reflex when presented with food, and he was measuring the amount of saliva that dogs were producing. But he noticed an interesting phenomenon that the dogs would actually start salivating in the presence of the bowl of the food, or when his lab technicians were just entering the room. And so this kind of presented. So Pavlov became real interested in why this was occurring, and he basically, in his experiment with presenting the dog with food alongside a metronome. For example, that would be like the neutral stimulus, the metronome. The dog would actually get accustomed to that neutral stimulus, that metronome, and that would become a conditioned stimulus where it would result in a conditioned response. For example, when Pavlov would introduce the metronome when it clicked, and then present the food right after, and then the dog will start salivating, and so by conditioning the dog to respond to this every time with the metronome clicking, the metronome by itself, solely without the unconditional stimulus, which is the food, will trigger the dog to salivate, which that would become the conditioned stimulus with the metronome. And so I think Pavlov's understanding how classical conditioning really works is a very important concept, because by us understanding how it works and how it relates to us in the world, we can actually use this to our own advantage to kind of trick ourselves into performing conditional responses, just because by knowing how it works. For example, like by playing when watching a scary movie, for example, when it's a very, very tense moment, and you're kind of being feared with scary faces and all that kinds of stuff. By introducing loud music or a certain type of music, that will automatically trigger us a conditioned response of fear and terror, kind of a thing. And so, but we can use it to our own advantages, for either for studying or productivity, kind of a thing. But next, in Watson's experiment, he was trying to demonstrate how classical conditioning can relate to phobias. And so his study began with a little 9-year-old boy, and he was named Little Albert, where he was introduced with neutral stimulus like a bright rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, a costume mask, and a ball of white wool. Initially, the little Albert was very curious to these items. He showed no emotional responses to these, but a couple months later, when little Albert was 11 months old, Watson kind of started his conditioning trials, where every time little Albert was presented the white rat, Watson would would create a very loud noise by using a hammer to hit an iron bar, and that would just produce a very loud noise, which will automatically, our unconditional response is to kind of jump or to be fearful. And so that's exactly what happened with little Albert, as Watson kept performing the loud noise presented with a white rat. And later on, little Albert became very, very fearful of that white rat, and kind of developed a little phobia. And it kind of generalized with all the other kind of topics, with the dog, the costume, the white wool, and even the rabbit. And so little Albert became very, very fearful of all those things, just because of that neutral or that unconditional stimulus, which was that loud bang. And so that classical conditioning kind of like reacted little Albert into seeing those conditional stimulus as fearful objects. And so I do believe, I think what Watson kind of demonstrated in his experiment kind of relates to how phobias can really originate from classical conditioning, from traumatic events, such as terrible things that happen in your life, or where you might have got you might be fearful of bees because you once experienced a bee sting and it really, really hurt, and so you're very fearful of bees in the future. But I do think when treating kind of like phobias, I think it's an interesting kind of concept where we can actually kind of like realize that these phobias are created based of neutral stimulus. And so by understanding that, for example, some people are fearful of caterpillars. Caterpillars are originally neutral stimulus. They're not a harm to us. And by kind of reverse, kind of counter classical conditioning, that understanding that these are neutral stimulus and that they're not harmful, we can actually learn to remove those phobias and kind of be content with those kind of things around us. And then Brandua's experiment was where he was where he was trying to understand observational learning, especially in children, children to be specific, and basically he broke up the two children. He broke up a group of preschoolers into two groups, where one would view an adult playing with an inflatable doll, and he was nicknamed Bodo, kind of like calmly and contently. And then in the other group, they view the preschoolers viewed the adult being violent with the inflatable doll, and kind of being a very, very aggressive. And what was quite interesting that Bandura found was that the children actually kind of reenacted whatever the adult did. And so, for example, if the adult was very calm, or the children who saw the adult very calmly play with Bodo, the children would act calmly around Bodo and kind of like play with their other toys. But with children who saw the adult very aggressive with Bodo, they too reenacted the adult and were very, very aggressive with Bodo. And so, and I think also an interesting fact was that later that Bandura kind of realized there's a kind of that reward plays a role in this kind of observational learning, where children who where he broke up the preschoolers into three separate groups, and they all saw the adult being violent with Bodo, but they were grouped up differently, where one group would see the adult being rewarded for his aggressive behavior. Another group, which would be the controlled group, would see the adult being kind of like there would be no reward kind of a thing. It kind of be like kind of neutral kind of a thing. Nothing really happens. And then the last group would would see the adult being punished for his aggressive behavior. And what's quite interesting is that, of course, the children who saw the adult being rewarded for his aggressive behavior reenacted that behavior of being aggressive with Bodo. And then also the children who viewed the adult being punished kind of backtracked, and they were less likely to be aggressive towards Bodo. And I think also one thing that Bandura kind of pointed out was that all these children learn the behavior of being aggressive to Bodo, but it's what of the fact that they actually performed the behavior was kind of another story. And so I do kind of see the dilemma with in our kind of like future cases with determining whether video games are encourages aggression in children, especially if they were violent, kind of a thing. And I think it all comes down to vicarious learning, whether children are kind of rewarded for that behavior or not. And so, and I think if children learn in very, very early stages that kind of aggression behavior is not rewarded, and it's kind of seen as a behavior that's not good, and it's kind of punished, even though the children knows that behavior and understands that how to kind of perform that act, they're more or less likely to perform those, just because they understand the consequences and the punishments that occur with it. And so I do realize that all these experiments are very fundamental to how we learn, and I'm very eager to learn more about these in the future. So thank you so much. Take care.